You've discovered the Techno-Progressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. Today on Techno-Progressive Hub, I'm speaking with Dr. Evie Kendal, a bioethicist and public health scientist at Australia's Swinburne University of Technology. She's the author of the provocative and influential monograph, Equal Opportunity in the Case for State-Sponsored Ectogenesis, in which she argued that artificial wombs are a potential requirement for genuine social and gender equality. In her latest volume, Science Fiction and the Ethics of Artificial Wombs, Dr. Kendal pivots to the imagination as a laboratory, a theme that is familiar to the IET. She critiques the traditional bioethical reliance on sterile clinical vignettes, arguing instead that the thick narratives found in science fiction, from the cautionary tales of Aldous Huxley to the liberating visions of Marge Piercy and Octavia Butler, provide a more robust framework for anticipating the social and political shocks of emerging biotechnologies. So welcome, Dr. Kendal.
Thank you.
And before we came on, we noted that we had published an article of yours 11 years ago, and I'm going to pull that back out and put it back up because it's languishing in our archive. But I also recently, I don't know if you saw, I recently published a piece about artificial wombs as well, short history. And I was fascinated to go back to JBS Haldane and the work of that circle in Britain in 1910 to 1930s. And they were fascinated by the artificial womb, and they had vigorous debates about whether it was going to be a feminist innovation or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why science fiction is such a good lens for discussion of ectogenesis or artificial wombs, because it's always had a connection. Like even the term itself, ectogenesis, came from, as you're saying, Haldane and that tradition. So it means that it's got this legacy history, and we can use that to imagine it moving into the future as well.
Right. Now, I wanted to actually start with the science because in the intervening decade, there's been a lot of progress on artificial wombs, and I assume that you're up on that because you're also a biopolicy person and you've been doing research on reproductive technology, attitudes, and use in Australia. So what's your current assessment of how close we are to the artificial womb?
Well, it's interesting because, as you note from my older article, I've been in this field for a while now. I think it's almost coming up to 15 years or something. And when I first started, I was told the artificial womb is around the corner. It's coming next year. And then it's coming in 5 years. And no, it's 10 years. No, it's 50 years. And then a few people, 100 years, or it's never coming. And the reality is we have made significant progress in that sort of 10-ish years, but it's definitely not around the corner, and it may not be in a few years' time either. But we are approaching the point where the science may not be the barrier any longer. It might be the law and policy, and that's when we need to really focus on the ethics and law piece of the puzzle. Because at the moment, we've moved from animal experimentation using basically tanks of synthetic amniotic fluid, or some of those experiments are obviously just done in water. And from there, we've actually gone to what's closer to a Ziploc bag, so sort of like a plastic bag full of this fluid. And we've got pump systems that are actually exchanging fluids, getting rid of waste products from the developing fetus, which is obviously animal studies at this point, and obviously supplying the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. And that technology is significantly more advanced than what we had before, which was basically just, an arterial venous pump system in a vat of water, basically.
And all of these technologies are being developed for clinical application because of neonatal intensive care. And so extracorporeal membrane oxygenation is one of the things that's been developed. And that seems to be making steady progress as well.
Yes, the main issue with ECMO for this kind of use is miniaturizing all the components. So at the moment, we don't have something that's essentially small enough. And that's also the problem with some of the tubes that we're using. So at present, the animal trials are basically extracting a partially formed animal fetus and putting it in the test artificial womb. Whereas if we wanted to do something that was from, say, conception, we would probably be using quite a different iteration of this technology. I assume, based on the current knowledge we have, and of course, this kind of testing is not legal, so no one has actually tested this, but we assume that we would need some sort of organic shell to work with, and that an embryo would need to be able to implant in some sort of blood rich tissue and develop its own placenta, essentially, as it does in the organic womb. And that we would therefore need to essentially sustain what would be very close to a living organ, so more of a synthetic organ than something like the bio bags that are currently being used. So it's a little bit difficult to speculate on that because that kind of testing is not legal. No one's working in that window, which is essentially between, say, 2 weeks post conception up to 18 weeks of gestation, somewhere around there. So the tests that are going on at the moment that are applying for like human trial permission are more focused on that 18 to 24 week window of gestation, where we are currently seeing some fetuses being born but not able to survive and not able to benefit from the current air-based neonatal ICU sort of humidity cribs that we have. So trying to keep those premature infants in a fluid-filled environment so that their lungs can continue to develop is the goal here.
Mhm. Now, one of the concerns that I mentioned at the outset that you were inspired partly by Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time. I remember reading it back in the 70s as a teenager. And she has in that scenario, she actuates the vision of Shulamith Firestone that future feminist or socialist feminist society would provide artificial wombs as a way to liberate women from the burden of having children. Um, and I have argued that case consistently since then. And more recently, I think there has been some interest on the part of the anti-abortion folks to take this technology, if it ever develops, and use it for what they would call fetal rescue. So have you seen some of that discourse in Australia as well, or is it distinctly crazy American anti-abortion people talking about that?
It's definitely something that has been discussed. And obviously, back in the 90s, we had Leslie Cannold actually doing some qualitative research on public opinions toward this technology were it to be developed. And what was interesting there was even people who were personally opposed to abortion, when provided with the hypothetical, would you prefer if you were in a situation where you had an unwanted pregnancy? Would you take up the opportunity to transfer that fetus into an artificial womb to have it subsequently adopted if it was born alive? And the overwhelming sort of discussion there was no, even if you were opposed to abortion, you'd still choose abortion over that. Because there was this attitude that if the child exists at all, you have abandoned it. And therefore, there's negative connotations there in terms of, social opinions about maternity and all of those things. So that was very interesting. But of course, that was quite a limited sample, and it was back in the 90s. When we ask similar questions now, and I've done this myself, it is very interesting to see the number of people that rely on science fiction references and even films from a similar time period, things like The Matrix, when they're talking about why they would or would not support this technology. And when it comes to the anti abortion sort of camp, it's a real concern that some people are conflating this technology with something that would be focused on avoiding terminations of pregnancy, because the overwhelming majority of those are done very early in development. They're done very safely through medication, whereas to transfer a partially formed fetus into an artificial womb would be a major surgical intervention according to the current science we have. And it would have to occur much later in development for safety. And that's an incredible burden on the woman or the person who's gestating. And what we have there, of course, is very non-equivalent situations, very safe, tested medication very early versus an untested surgical intervention with much later gestation. A lot of those physical and psychological burdens of pregnancy have already occurred by that stage. And of course, when we're looking at the safety for the fetus, we don't have that data regarding what might happen if we do that. So they're definitely not equivalent. And part of the reason people working on this technology are really just focused on the window that they are is they don't want to be associated with the idea that we might use this for replacement of biological gestation. They say that's not their interest. They are only interested in saving the lives of premature infants that are otherwise not going to survive. So they're not interested in testing it as an alternative to abortion. They're definitely not interested in full ectogenesis, as I would call it. They're only focused on, a tragic situation where someone's having a wanted pregnancy and they go into premature labor, for example.
A couple of years ago, the Chinese government was grappling with the fact that their birth rate was collapsing and it's collapsing around the world. And a Chinese official made an offhand comment, which I have not seen followed up by any policy, but he made the offhand comment that if women stopped having babies, they would just have to industrialize the process. And I was like, wait, what? Because the scenario of China actually, China being a country where pronatal activity now is being pushed. They're trying to restrict abortion and contraception and encourage women to have more children because they see this coming birth dearth. And a country that's also much less anxious about the use of reproductive technologies, even eugenic, genetic engineering, and those kinds of technologies. And so, if there were to be a country that might adopt something like a mass use of artificial wombs, it would probably be a place like China. Do you think that the pronatal concerns that are now very prevalent in many different countries may give more attention to this kind of a technology?
I definitely think the countries that are experiencing that birth decline are the ones that are pursuing this kind of technology a much greater sort of seriousness. So we're looking at Japan, South Korea, these countries that are experiencing that decline in birth rate. And of course, part of that is because aging populations are a problem all over the world. We have a lack of a strong tax base and a care base, so people are able to look after these children and these elderly people who require care. So some of that is being sort of offset by pursuit of things like social robotics, so nursing robots, for example. When it comes to birth, of course, some people are discussing how do we industrialize this? How do we replace this with a technological solution? And for those working in the field, what they're focusing on is how do we save all the lives that we can? Because, of course, that increases the number of people who are born. Because if you can save the premature infants, you are going to have more people. And of course, that is also how we ended up with things like humidicribs in the first place. Countries that were concerned about premature babies dying were the only ones really interested in pursuing something that could save them. So we're in the same situation now where we have a lot greater technological sort of advancement where we could theoretically artificially gestate in a very different way. And it will probably be the countries most concerned about their population that will pursue this. In my country, in Australia, of course, this kind of experimentation wouldn't be legal under our current system. So we don't have trials going on here to the same level that you'll find in other countries. But if there was a significant shift in our concerns about the population, we might find that willingness to engage with further testing of even technologies that might help in the 20 to 24-week gestation period might find a great deal more social and political support.
Well, as you say, the preemie barrier right now is about 20 weeks for any kind of rescue, and it's still pretty poor prognosis at that point. But that's the typical way that these kinds of technologies would become more useful would be that it would be useful for 19 weeks and then 18 weeks and then 17 weeks, and it would go all the way back. And then
Yeah.
eventually we would have an artificial womb. So it would start with the clinical practice and then eventually become something that would be useful enough and demonstrated enough that everyone would use it, I would imagine. Um, but you are arguing from a liberal feminist point of view, and this kind of technology, reproductive technology, since the 70s has been a target for many feminists, arguing that it's men's attempt to steal the power of birth from women through, mechanizing the process, or it's a capitalist intrusion into the process, and that the end result of this would be literally the Brave New World, which we'll talk about in a second. But how do you push back on that and argue that this kind of technology, if it were to be perfected, would in fact have a liberatory benefit?
Well, we'd have to fight for that to be the case. And that's my primary argument, that we can't just let the technology serendipitously come into existence in the way that you were describing without having already had these conversations and already enshrining things in law that protect women's rights and particularly their reproductive rights. And when we think about do men control a lot of reproductive technology? Yes, they do. But they've always controlled reproductive capacity throughout history particularly in Western sort of democracies. We've seen a lot of coercion when it comes to reproductive behaviors and a lot of policing of women's bodies. And what we're looking at here is not a new form of oppression, but it's definitely potentially able to exacerbate a lot of those inequalities and a lot of that sort of burden for women and other gestating people. So now is the time to actually think about those issues and protect the rights of individuals to, for example, choose if to use this technology, when to use the technology, to have the support they need to not use the technology, and the right to not use the technology if that is their preference. And that would include for people who might have dangerous pregnancies otherwise. Because at the moment, we do still allow people to decide for themselves if they want to take that risk. We don't ban pregnancy from people who will have high risk pregnancies. And it's a really important part of reproductive liberty that we maintain that, because the alternatives are things like the historical abuses that we've seen, like forced sterilization of people that governments or society decided were not fit to procreate. And that's obviously a human rights violation. So we definitely don't want to see this technology exacerbating those kinds of issues, but it requires a conscious effort to avoid it. So it definitely has liberatory potential for people who otherwise would have to gestate and either don't want to or it's not safe for them to do so. This is providing an option that currently isn't available. And for some people and couples, engaging surrogacy is a solution, but for many people, it's not. So if you
Is
were
surrogacy
born without a
legal in
uterus,
Australia?
altruistic surrogacy is legal. We are currently in debates, and I mean, literally over the next couple of months, we're doing a law reform commission report on whether we should change that situation and allow compensated surrogacy. But we will not know the results of that discussion for some time. But at the moment, altruistic surrogacy is available, but there are, of course, restrictions on who can be a surrogate and who can engage a surrogate and how that process can work. For example, it's illegal to advertise those kinds of services. So if you want a surrogate, you can't find an advertisement to find one. So things like that we're currently debating. But for a lot of people, that's not a solution. And for some people, it's simply not a desirable solution because they don't want to sort of offload that gestational labor onto someone else and the psychological, physiological, social, financial burden onto someone else's body. But they potentially might want to outsource it to a machine because you can't instrumentalize a machine. It is, in fact, an instrument. So when we're thinking about liberatory potential, we're also looking at people being able to choose how their children are gestated in a way that aligns with their values.
Yeah, the problem with surrogacy has been classically that the birth mother has a claim to the child, and so the idea of having a contract that obliges the birth mother to give the child over, even in a compensated situation, has been very problematic. So, have you written about this or thought about this? The various claims of the birth mother versus the genetic parents. I'm much more sympathetic to the birth mother. The labor is much more significant there than donating your gamete.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about the difference between, say, gestational parenthood, genetic parenthood, social parenthood, we have to remember that technology is the only reason we've separated those aspects of parenthood. So that is a direct result of technological intervention. I am also very sympathetic to the idea that the gestational labour is the most important, and remembering that that is not limited to surrogacy. That's every single gestating individual in any circumstance has contributed significantly more than a genetic contribution. So, obviously, if we're dealing with gestating mothers who have also been using their own genetic material, then they're contributing a vast deal more than the other genetic contributor. And part of that is just remembering that although we have it in our heads that, a baby is 50% mum and 50% dad, that's not even true genetically. So even on the very basic level, that's not true. They are slightly more maternal than they are paternal in sort of makeup genetically. But also, the gestation is not just the labor itself. It's not just using the body and the organs and all of that energy to actually create the future infant. They are literally constructed out of materials that are extracted from that body. So we're not just talking the nutrients in the diet that that person eats while they're pregnant. If they don't get enough calcium, for example, that fetus will simply draw it straight out of their skeleton. So we have pregnant people who start losing their teeth because they're losing sort of a lot of calcium. And we have issues where, of course, a lot of pregnant people end up with changes to their vision because of the process itself. And you might find that they're going to be deficient in other nutrients because the burden of actually sustaining another life form is really quite extreme. But they are materially derived, as some of our authors say, from that body. So it's like if someone said that, baking a cake is 50% this part of the recipe and 50% of this part of the recipe. It's neglecting the ingredients and the oven. So like it's not just the data that goes into it, it's not the genetic code that goes into it. Like that's like saying the recipe is how you make a cake. It's like, well, no, you follow the recipe. Of course you follow the recipe, and the recipe might be contributed to by various sources, but the ingredients have to come from somewhere, and then you have to bake it. And
Hmm.
all of that is coming from the gestational labor. So, I mean, that's an important thing to consider for all pregnancies, not just those that might be involving a surrogate or any other circumstances.
Well, let's talk about the science fiction a little bit. And I have been a lay amateur science fiction critic for a very long time and taught my first course on science fiction back in 1990, The Politics of Science Fiction. So I've always been very engaged with this particular topic. And like you, very frustrated at how it impacts the emerging technologies domain because Frankenstein does not teach us about the ethics of organ transplantation, and Brave New World does not teach us about the ethics of Prozac or Feelies or any of the other technologies introduced there. And most of science fiction, as you would, I'm sure, agree, is like Michael Crichton. It's, every Michael Crichton novel was, let's take a technology and imagine the worst possible thing that could happen with it over and over again. Um, and an example of artificial wombs that goes this direction is Frank Herbert had in the Dune series. He had oxalotl tanks, which were actually not artificial so much, but actually women that were um, mutilated and turned into artificial wombs. But so the imagination around this has often been horrific. Um, but in Brave New World, it wasn't, as you have pointed out, it wasn't actually the artificial wombs that should bother people about Brave New World.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about some of these dystopian classics, what's really interesting is even those that involve artificial wombs, they're almost never about the artificial womb. But when you think about why do people fixate on that element then? It's because it's very difficult to picture what is actually dystopian about some of these things because they're socio-political realities. It's hard to draw an image of that in your mind. And when you're reading science fiction or you're watching science fiction, a lot of it is the visual. It's something that makes you imagine an alternate world. And it's difficult to do that without some physical representation of something. And an artificial womb is a locus where you can actually focus that negative energy, so to speak. So when you're thinking about what is so terrible about Brave New World, if in fact you believe it is a dystopia, because people argue that it isn't, if you believe it's dystopian, what is actually dystopian about it? And you would have to sort of end up with the conclusion that it's the social conditioning of people and their lack of genuine autonomy. So it's not that they're not happy, because we
And
know
an
that they are
enforced class
happy.
structure.
Yeah. So it's your social conditioning to fulfill a particular role, and you are no longer free to have the full range of human emotions because everyone's happy because it's mandatory. And that's really what's terrible about this, because they are happy. They're taking their drugs, they're going to their feeling movies, they're doing whatever it is, and
Free
they are
love.
happy. Yeah, exactly. And it's not genuine because they don't really have the freedom to experience anything else. And that's what really sort of hammers that home. And people, although they are conditioned to be happy in their class, they don't have any choice there. So they were literally created to fulfill that role in that society. And you might say, well, it's dystopian on one level, but also in the present reality we have, people are stuck in certain social classes and they are suffering as a result of that. And if we are not helping to, build people up and get them a better quality of life, and then we look at Brave New World and say that's dystopian. I'm like, well, it's exactly the same reality, except at least in one of them we tried to make it feel better, even if it's not actually better. So I think that's where the debate about whether it is actually more ambiguous than people often think on first reading. But the technology gets demonized because it's the easiest thing to draw a mental picture of. And therefore, it captures the imagination and allows us to think about some of these issues, whereas just describing social conditioning would be quite difficult to form an image of. So we end up with one technology and another technology essentially being conflated. And that's often the case for science fiction looking at artificial wombs. It's often not just artificial gestation that's being depicted, it's also mass market cloning or human augmentation or the creation of slave classes or military classes or whatever it is. So it's very rarely actually about the artificial womb.
I think another point that you often make, which I often bring up around Gattaca, is that the film Gattaca is often seen as some kind of indictment of genetic technologies. And I point out to people that the protagonist is someone who was intentionally harmed by his parents and given a heart defect that will kill him by the time he's 30. And his response to this limitation on his life chances is not to what should be true in that world, get some kind of therapy to fix his heart and then pursue his dream of becoming an astronaut. It's instead to steal the genetic material of another person and defraud NASA so that he can go and die in space. And that if anyone did that today with the space program, you would consider them to be a criminal and a terrible person. But somehow it's turned around in Gattaca to be this wonderful thing and an indictment of genetic technology, which it has nothing to do with in the story.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because even the way you phrase that as his parents deliberately sort of gave him a heart defect, my understanding at the sort of outset of the film is more that
They
it
didn't
captures that
choose
they didn't
perfection.
choose to, yeah.
Yeah,
So it was less that they deliberately caused it, but they allowed it to happen. And obviously,
yeah,
in the ethics classroom, we often talk about the difference between, choosing and allowing. So they had everything they needed to prevent that and chose not to prevent it.
right.
And of course, in the younger brother, they do choose to prevent anything sort of genetically impacting their health. And what's interesting there is technically you can say, well, the parents did nothing wrong because they let nature take its course. They simply chose to reject a technology they didn't agree with. And they were therefore willing to raise the child that had the heart defect, even though that meant the heart defect was going to stand in their way in pursuing their goals. But then you do also see the parents really hammering home that, you should try and do your best and not be limited by these circumstances, even though the society that you've been born into essentially mandates that you will never achieve certain things because you're being discriminated against. And what's interesting, of course, is, as you say, it's not actually about genetic engineering at all, really. And if the point of view, if the protagonist was someone who otherwise would have had a life limiting condition or something that caused a severe disability, was saved from that and became a successful astronaut, we would be celebrating the genetic technology. Thank goodness that protagonist got access. And if you imagine a story where the access to that technology was gatekeep, sort of had this gatekeeping sort of financial aspect to it, we would celebrate if you had found a way to buy that technology, or someone had generously donated that technology, or all of a sudden you managed to steal it in some heist. Like that would be the point of the narrative. What a wonderful thing that we managed to stick it to the man and capitalism, and we managed to extract this wonderful piece of technology and make it more democratically available. But the protagonist is different in that story. So it's always focusing on, we've got this character that's disadvantaged, discriminated against, and how he's going to navigate that. So it's all about the point of view. The narrative point of view is what's determining who we sympathize with, what version of technology integrated into society we are being positioned to support. And then, of course, whether or not we follow that depends on how compelling that character is.
So the way that Brave New World or Frankenstein or Gattaca enters into bioethics discourse is often very problematic, as we're talking about. But you still are making the argument that the way that bioethicists often construct case studies and say, Dax was burned over 80% of his body and he still wanted to live in the end. And therefore, we should allow people to force people to live even when they want to die. Those kinds of cases, that those are equally sterile and misleading in some ways. So, what are the risks and benefits on each side of the thick science fiction story and the clinical case?
Yeah, the clinical case is interesting because I think it's Todd Chambers that refers to those as folkloric shorthand. So instead of having to have a huge debate about autonomy, and particularly respecting autonomy in life-saving situations where someone's rejecting a life-saving technology or intervention, instead of having to go through that whole debate, you just say DAX, and everyone knows what you're talking about. That's a shorthand, but it loses a lot of the nuance of the actual case because it's been stripped down to the bare bones so that it's only that one single message that we're receiving. We're just getting that one bit. And if you're going to do that with a real life narrative, it may as well have just been a fictional case to begin with. And that's part of, I think, Chambers' argument there, that it is no more real than using a science fiction story at that point, because you've stripped it down, you've taken away anything that made it truly a rich human case, and you've distilled it to a single bioethical principle or whatever it is. And one of the issues we have with the use of science fiction in bioethics is often the teacher of the bioethics is simply looking for a way to demonstrate a core principle by using a story, but that leaves the core principles above scrutiny. So we're looking at the case narratives, we're looking at the vignettes, we're looking at the science fiction story, just looking for what we already expect to find, what we've already got in the hallowed halls of bioethics education. And of course, I am thinking of, the principlism, the four principles that people talk about. And instead of that, I'm arguing that we should actually let the story tell us what the bioethical issues are rather than searching for what we already think is there. So, genuinely engaging with the point of view of the character, genuinely engaging with alternative interpretations of the narrative, and allowing the issues to actually come from the text in a more genuine interaction with that text in its totality. So, when it comes down to who's responsible for making sure these stories can tell a rich, true, nuanced story regarding bioethical issues, it can't be the science fiction author. We would love to have some sort of standard of scientific plausibility. Scientists would love it if science fiction stories were a little more believable in terms of the science, because humans often exaggerate what's possible technologically because they've been fed stories from science fiction where things are happening that they believe are happening in the real world or might very soon happen in the real world. And it often means that when a new piece of technology is released, people already have unrealistic expectations on what it can do. So even things like robots that we're producing now, people expect them to be far more autonomous and far more articulate in terms of movement and speech, of course, than they can be. And it's because they've seen robots for years that could talk and walk and interact with objects and whatever. So when these robots look a bit like what they've seen in science fiction, they're already casting these very unrealistic expectations on them. And
You,
that's very
you know,
difficult for the scientists.
what I think is fascinating about that also is that LLMs are being trained on the entire corpus of human writing that's available, including every science fiction novel, script, screenplay, movie that's
Yep.
ever been produced. And so when you ask an LLM whether they're conscious or what their interior life is and things like that, they're drawing on our entire imagination about that, both the negative and the positive versions of robots in the past. So we're both, delving deep into the collective unconscious here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great contribution. I think it's actually good that these philosophical debates that have occurred in science fiction are part of the conversation when it comes to the actual release of things like artificial intelligence and particularly generative AI. But when it comes down to it, do I wish they had more representative samples that were actually scientifically plausible? To some extent. But the duty of the science fiction author is actually to entertain rather than to educate. So their higher obligation is actually entertainment. And some of it might have an educative value, but they're not there in a didactic relationship with the reader. Whereas in bioethics, the education piece is a higher moral obligation. So arguing things in a genuine way, in a way that's not taking cheap shots, that's not misrepresenting alternative views, avoiding the straw man sort of arguments. That is one of our ethical obligations if we're engaging in genuine bioethical debate. So, my target when I discuss the misuse of science fiction in bioethics is when the cultural capital of a text that really has captured human imagination is being used in a way that is not genuinely engaging with the text or using it in a way that conflates issues with each other in the hopes that they can essentially leverage the outrage from a science fiction film in order to support an argument that really doesn't have a direct relationship with that representation or that tech or whatever it is. So when people use something like the Matrix to stir up opposition to artificial womb technology, when of course the Matrix is about artificial intelligence enslaving humanity, and the artificial wombs that are used are just used for the yuck factor, for the grotesque, for the imagery that's going to stick in people's minds. And that is very powerful imagery, but it means it can be very easily misused
Mhm.
to support an argument rather than arguing with genuine points about why someone's objecting to that technology. And of course, there are many genuine reasons why someone might oppose that technology. But I'm saying that we have an obligation not to take the cheap shot just because it has significant cultural capital.
One of the things that reproductive technology will presumably and is already providing is for queer people to have opportunities to reproduce in ways that they wouldn't have in the past. Sperm donation and other kinds of in vitro fertilization and so forth. And I remember how revelatory it was to read Lois McMaster Bujold's Ethan of Athos, which was, I think, published in the late 80s,
Mhm.
early 90s, something like that. And it was about an all male planet, and they were using artificial womb technology and genetic merging of two, male gametes to create a child. And she totally normalized it in that story. It wasn't a horror tale. It was a very positive story. But do you think that, and there's been a real growth of queer fiction since then, queer science fiction, and many of them do play around with various reproductive alternatives. So do you have your favorites in that genre?
I mean, Ethan of Athos is one of my favorites in that genre, particularly because it teaches us just how much we rely on reproductive difference to understand gender roles in society.
Mhm.
Because once you take away that particular form of difference, that, one part of the species gestates and another part of the species doesn't, you end up with a character who's basically never seen a woman and describes them as a uterine replicator with legs. And that's a fascinating way to think about what if we took away all those assumptions about what a woman is, what it means to be a woman. If we took away all those assumptions because someone's never seen a woman before, what actually happens?
Hmm.
And in that case, of course, it's quite, I would say, quite a negative way to describe someone as a uterine replicator with legs. But it does highlight that alienation that we get in science fiction, which gives us the ability to consider something that otherwise would be too abstract to consider, or would be so bound up with our assumptions that we really couldn't separate it out from those assumptions.
Since we're geeking out about science fiction, I'll just say that Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice series has equally shocking revelatory effect because she uses, I think, the female pronoun for everybody. And it's
Yeah,
a culture in which acknowledging anything about someone's gender is considered extremely impolite. And so no one does it ever.
yeah.
But eventually you realize in the middle of the novel, oh, this person has a penis, and I've been thinking about them as a woman the entire time. And look how gendered my brain is that I can't possibly get out of this gendered way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And science fiction authors also play with that with people from different cultures as well. We make a lot of assumptions. We know that if we don't tell someone who the protagonist is in terms of certain gender markers and in terms of their cultural background or whatever, that people assume it's a white male. And they assume that because it's the main character, the authoritative voice, or whatever it is. And if we don't tell someone who the author of a work is, they also assume it's a white male. So we've got this very interesting thing where you can turn those expectations on their head just by not making those markers clear. And what's really interesting about that is the potential for embracing different cultures and different understandings of gender. We know that at least in the short term, you can stimulate empathy for, say, queer individuals among people who are deeply homophobic by giving them a really compelling narrative and not necessarily telling them the protagonist is queer until a certain point in the narrative. And we know that from studies, you can actually, at least temporarily, uh, produce a more sympathetic response to the struggles that queer people have been engaging with for a long time, even among people who have deeply homophobic views, if you give them a very compelling narrative that involves those barriers and challenges for a queer character that they've already built some sort of repertoire with. So they've got some sort of relationship with this character. So that rapport is very important. And that can be sustained, but only through repeated exposure in a very carefully calibrated way. So when people talk about we need more, representation of people from these cultures, and we need more representation of, these kind of gender norms, that's what they're talking about. That repeated sort of consolidation of those empathetic views that we can stimulate. And we capture it in the real world when people say something like, I used to have these views, and then I met someone from that cultural group, or I made friends with someone who's queer, and then I realized that person is just like me, they have the same rights as me, they have the same struggles as I do, and they become more empathetic. We can sort of simulate that to some extent through fictional characters if we don't have a real life person that we can sort of engage with. So I think that's very powerful. And in those cases you've discussed, sort of the bait and switch can have a negative effect as well if people then feel angry that they've been misled. But for the most part, if the story is good enough, they will keep reading and they'll be fascinated by their own assumptions and the biases that exposes. And I think it is good for us to be reminded of our sort of unconscious bias because we all have it. If we go looking for it, we will probably find some of it, but it helps to have some external sort of sources as well to bring that out.
One of the authors that you shout out in your work and that is, I think, rightly acknowledged, should be acknowledged, is Octavia Butler. And
Yeah.
you could say, in some ways, she's one of the queerest writers, even though she doesn't have, homosexuality very often in her stories, but she queers the body in very profound ways. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I loved using Dawn as my primary case study in my most recent book because obviously it has a sort of like Afrofuturist element to it, but it also has a very interesting use of the idea of artificial gestation. So technically, there are a couple of references to actual artificial gestation. They are very cursory mentions, So people often find it quite interesting that I chose that as my primary case study, given the fact that artificial wombs themselves are barely featured at all.
Mhm.
But the concepts and the challenges involved in sort of, as you say, queering the body, but also sort of looking at alternative social structures that would potentially support an artificial womb in reality. A lot of those issues are handled in great detail in that text. So, of course, they've introduced the idea of mixing your genes with an alien species and that being a
And not as a
sort of
horrific thing.
yeah, well, I mean, for the protagonist, it is fairly horrific. So I think it's interesting that the version of that species survival project that we see is from the point of view of someone who is horrified by
Mhm.
mixing genes.
Mhm.
So they want to go back to a very natural birth system. The main character, of course, talks about the fact that they did not want to give birth themselves in a hospital, and they chose a more natural setting, a sort of a birthing suite that was not connected to that sort of very well colonial version of medicine that they were experiencing in their lifetime on Earth. And then we've got all these technologies that could actually solve a number of the problems that that person had experienced, those issues of racism and disparate healthcare outcomes on those grounds. But they violently reject that technology as a solution. And I found that very interesting. So they're horrified by the fact that they are themselves going to be involuntarily impregnated with a cross species fetus. They're absolutely horrified by this. That's the main driver of that first book, avoiding that terrible reality for this person that really wants the more natural human only sort of system, even when it's explained to them that the species will not survive unless they engage in this gene trade system with this alien species, that humanity will become extinct otherwise. And it's fascinating because even in the face of extinction, they do not seriously consider an artificial womb system that would not require them themselves to go through that horrific cross species pregnancy that they're trying to avoid. They still reject it as a possibility, even though the problems that are set up in the narrative itself actually make that technology quite sympathetic, in my view. So that's what I wanted to capture there, because had we had a different protagonist, that would be a very different story. So to be like, thank goodness we have artificial wombs to take over this burden. Thank goodness this technology exists so that we don't have to have these potentially horrific, non-human. Sort of a lot of the narrative is focused on purity. They're not purely human. Thank goodness there's a way that we can outsource this labor that we don't want to do, that's unsafe, that's going to cost us the lives of very few surviving humans. Again, we don't get that version at all. But everything we need for that interpretation is there in the text. If you take a genuine approach to the text, you can say, well, yeah, this is actually potentially a solution to all of these problems and this species survival project that people find themselves in. And just looking at it is the narrative voice, it is the point of view, it's everything that goes into that technique of being an author that shuts down that version in the text itself. But the interpretation still exists for the reader. So you can still say, okay, actually, those artificial wombs that she walked past and disregarded immediately in one sentence, actually, we could tease that out in this society. Like, what would happen if instead of, sending the surviving humans off to try and survive in the woods, they actually used this technology and kept it all very sterile and safe and sort of preserved humanity as best as they could under those conditions.
But as I remember it, doesn't the protagonist come around in the subsequent novels and
Arguably.
embrace the alternate lifestyle?
Well, I mean, arguably, but keep in mind she's undergone a number of genetic enhancements and other augmentations. So I don't know if we can take
She's been
that sort of
forcibly
turnaround.
morally enhanced.
Well, maybe. I think there's definitely a case for that. I think because we know they've been mentally altered, we know they've been physically altered. So at that point, I think there is an open question there. Like, did
Mhm.
they come around or were they forced to come around? Was their neurological system altered to the ability to come around, or were they actually forced to? I couldn't really give a definitive answer there. I think it is an open question as to how genuine that sort of shift is.
It's so nice to reconnect with you, and I'm so glad that you have continued your interest in this topic and that you're involved in actual public policy because I think that we need more people who are on the bleeding edge of the imagination of these things, informing the way that we think about them in the day to day. I've been speaking with Dr. Evie Kendal. Her latest book is Science Fiction and the Ethics of Artificial Wombs. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
The Techno Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno Progressives.